I'm not sure I view what I do as practice. So
Okay.
I kind of, it's because what I do is not architecture anymore itself. It's very, it's very allied to architecture, but somehow the word practice feels like a very sort of self-conscious way of understanding the things you do. And I think I have a much more informal and more kind of ad hoc approach to what I do, because the news just keeps coming. So that, I
Mhm.
just have to keep an extent to which you just have to keep churning stuff out, and you can't treat everything in a way as a kind of intellectual exercise. Sometimes you just have to confront it as a job in a way. And I don't mean to sort of demean what I do or belittle it, but it's just not, sometimes it's not a very self-conscious process of thinking about what I do. And maybe that's a problem, actually. Maybe that's one of the the problems in contemporary media is that it's quite relentless.
Mhm.
There isn't the time that I think there used to be. I was reading a piece about the New Yorker in the 80s when people, I think it was Graydon Carter, was getting $1,700 per word, and you could maybe get away with doing two, possibly three articles a year. Now,
Mhm.
then you can talk about your practice.
Mhm.
And
But
it's a luxury that's disappeared, I think, now.
it's actually quite refreshing. I mean, you're almost the first person that's immediately said, well, no, it's not a practice. I wonder if it's not a practice, does that then allow you to do something else? Or does it allow you to explore things in a way that if you, let's say, saw it as a form of practice, that you wouldn't be able to really?
Yeah, I don't know. I suppose in a way, the world of art and architecture has bifurcated with the rise of the curator in the last 15, 20 years. Everyone is a kind of curator. They're curating their content, they're curating exhibitions and biennales, and in a way, I was very careful to sort of, in a way, steer clear of that word and just, I'm a journalist, or I'm a critic is in my title, which is a nice kind of upgrade. But really, I'm a journalist, and I used to be an architect, so I'm not. I'm from that world, and I feel part of it, and I have this interesting um, pang when occasionally people say to me, "Don't you miss architecture?" And and I have to say, I'm much. It's a weird thing, but I'm much closer to the culture of architecture now, doing what I do, than I was when I was practicing. When I was working as an architect, I was designing a kitchen or an agricultural building or a church conservation project, and it was the kind of, I don't want to say the bottom end of architecture, but it was the kind of hard end of architecture. A lot of work, very little reward. I wasn't doing art galleries and big cultural complexes. So whereas now I meet Jack Herzog and I talk to him over a coffee, or I interview Frank Gehry or whatever it might be, and I'm talking about I am really talking about the top end of the sort of the intellectual and sculptural and formal ends of architecture, and why things are the way they are, and the world beyond, and culture, and so on. So I'm actually, in a way, I feel myself to be much more involved in the culture of architecture now than I was when I was an architect.
Mhm. Well, there is something, I actually feel exactly the same way. I mean, when I left practice, when I started teaching, I was like, well, this is actually what I wanted to do in practice. I wanted to talk about ideas,
Exactly.
something that actually in practice, it's so rare.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. You can do it if you're wealthy. So if you're there are quite a few architects from affluent backgrounds, and you notice that they can pick and choose their work. And they only do, interesting projects, but I'm afraid that was shut out for me when I had to make a living doing it. And I think for most people, it's not an option. You have to make money somehow. And the money is not necessarily in as you say, in the kind of more intellectually engaged end of it.
So what would then distinguish you as a journalist in terms of, let's say, how you position yourself in, let's say, architectural discourse? Because
Yeah.
presumably journalists has to be open to all ideas.
Yeah.
Whereas I think
Yeah.
when you're kind of an actor in the architectural discourse, you have to have a very specific or a very precise position. So how do you then define yourself in that conversation?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. It's a very good question. And I think it's one that has changed radically in the last 20 years, let's say, or 15 years, because of the climate crisis.
Mhm.
So when I started doing what I do, in fact, when I started as an architect and when I started as a journalist, architecture was a kind of noble pursuit. You know, architects were proud to be doing what they did, and they were fond of buildings. There was always a kind of paper architecture delegation who disliked the actual building and thought that the theoretical was more defensible than the practical. But there was a discourse between those two.
Mhm.
And what's happened in recent years, I think, is that there's such a burden of guilt on the culture of architecture about what construction is doing to the planet, that particularly for a younger generation, there's an uncertainty about whether they actually like architecture or not, or whether they want to be involved in this field because of the toxicity and the carbon and the land rights and the social inequality and everything else, capital labor. There's much more of a consciousness now about the complicity of construction in the collapse of the climate, and beyond that into the kind of broader social infrastructure. And that uncertainty, I think, has made architecture something very different. You go to a biennale now, and it's a kind of hand-wringing apology for building, really, rather than a celebration. And I'm not criticizing that. I'm not criticizing that at all. I think it's fine, and I think every generation needs to respond to what they do and the kind of the situation of the world as it is then. But nevertheless, it's become something slightly different to when I was younger, which was more about finding the kind of cultural interest in architecture. Now it's more about the things around architecture, landscape, decolonization, decarbonization, all of the kind of other things that we're so familiar with. So it's become something else. And to go back to your question, how I position myself is somewhere in between those things, because I'm still someone who really enjoys building, who enjoys the actual buildings. But I have a lot of sympathy with the younger generation who says, well, that's yesterday's news. Really now we need to be doing something much more radical and adaptive reuse and rewilding and all these other things that the younger people are more interested in, which is equally interesting, and I'm supportive of it. I just think that there's a hinge or a sort of pivot at the moment in which there is this immense sense of guilt in architecture, which I think is a little bit like my position is I think it's a little bit dangerous,
Mm-hmm.
because if architects turn away from architecture, then the construction industry is left to people who don't care about architecture. And
Yeah.
and so the answer in a very roundabout way, the answer to your question is that I see myself as someone with a kind of a platform in the Financial Times where I'm able to try to suggest why architecture is a good thing, why good architecture is worthwhile still, and useful socially, economically, intellectually. But I still feel that my job is to promote architectural culture in the wider discourse.
Mm-hmm.
And that's all of architecture culture. So I'm trying to also, discuss the issues with architecture as well as the positives and the problems.
I mean, what's remarkable is that you've done that. I was just looking up the year that, you started in 1999,
Mm-hmm.
Financial Times. So I think there's something in that commitment and the kind of endurance in an institution and in one kind of mode of expressing yourself, which is like
Yeah,
word,
yeah,
that I guess allows you to have that view.
yeah.
Do you think that's something remarkable? I mean, do you think that's something unusual?
Yeah, I think it's unusual, and I have to credit the Financial Times for sticking with it because most newspapers have got rid of their architectural critics. There are three in Britain, of which I'm one, and I don't know how many in the States. Two, maybe. I think full-time architecture critics in the States, maybe one. So the Anglosphere is not exactly stuffed with architecture critics. So we're in this slightly odd, almost kind of slightly retrograde position of being rather in a rather old-fashioned job. Critic is rather an unfashionable thing now. It's in where the multiplicity of views is paramount. A critic is just a kind of rather old-fashioned figure, I think. And I have to give credit to my editors and my bosses at the FT for sticking with it, thinking that it's worth having a full-time theatre critic and a film critic and a opera critic, because these are forms of culture that have something to say within the kind of broader news, broader global news context. And clearly, without without wishing to sound arrogant, people are still interested in reading architecture because they read my articles. You can see the audience engagement. It's just that the rest of the media has lost faith in architecture as a subject. It's not that there's not an interest. It's that there's a kind of lack of understanding that this is a legitimate cultural sphere.
I guess there's also something, I mean, to be honest, like to be fully frank, I think there's probably something privileged in the position of the Financial Times, which
Yeah,
of course takes
absolutely.
a certain kind of audience that actually probably does see value in
Yeah, that's absolutely right. It's a money-making newspaper. It makes a profit, which is almost unheard of. B, it's not owned by an oligarch, so there isn't a new. It's owned by Nikkei, the Japanese media and finance conglomerate. So there's no angle. They have no angle to pursue. There's no agenda that's being pushed. Um, so there's those two things, and there's an understanding. You're absolutely right. The understanding that the people who read the Financial Times are the people who go to the theatre, go to art galleries, live in nice houses, maybe commission buildings as well. That's a big part of it. I think that's probably one of the reasons I'm relatively well read within the Financial Times, is because it's that audience. So you're absolutely right. I'm not claiming it's down to me or my kind of, my brilliant journalism. It's a subject that coincides with the interests there.
Mhm.
So it's lucky.
Yes, and so I think that's just a caveat, but I guess nevertheless, I just curated this series, this event at the Architectural Association, the
Yeah.
Publishing Architecture Forum, which we were in.
Yes. I'm sorry I couldn't come to that. It
Oh,
sounds really good.
next year.
Yeah, it sounds really good, I've got to say.
It was great. It was actually really, really great. I think partially because of the multiplicity of voices. So we had everyone from Tom Ravenscroft, the editor of
Yeah.
Gazette, to Lars Muller. So there was
Yeah.
a kind of a variety of voices and positions. And so what was really interesting is that there was a sentiment across the board that no one reads, that this
Yeah.
has become a point in culture, that our text is losing certain value. But then when I do think about you, and I do read what you write,
Right.
and I guess I don't know whether it's because of the platform, because when I buy usually every weekend, it's because I am gonna read it,
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And
And you've committed to it. You've bought it. It's big, it's serious. So you sit down and read it. Yeah.
Yes. I think, I don't know, maybe there's like an element of commitment, but I'm interested in how you think about this idea that no one reads or that the word is dead, and what actually is happening in the culture. You've actually hinted at the fact that maybe that's not the case.
It's a tough one because I know that there's obviously a generational divide. That the younger generation, people in their 20s, certainly don't read as much, and they read differently. They read, in snippets, and they read online. They read on a screen, which is, I think, a very different experience because you're always just another tab away from a link or another or a distraction or an email. So you're not immersing yourself in a book. So that's very different. But I think it's also possible to patronize younger people. Um, and it's particularly older people like me who think, well, younger people don't read. They're always, they're on TikTok, they're looking at social media, they're consuming culture in a different way. Actually, my personal experience is not really that they do, it's that they do read. I've got two daughters, grown-up daughters, 21, 23. They both read quite a lot. Now, they grew up in a house full of books, so it's a different, it's as you to use the word you used, it's a privileged environment. But I've taught at the AA. I taught a writing course the year before last, and they were well-read students, in their early 20s. And you just look at the kinds of books that sell in the, even in the high street bookshops. It's quite surprising. There's a lot of serious literature selling quite well. So I think it's easy to be too pessimistic about the future of reading. I think, my experience actually is that people do read, and it's maybe maybe that the kind of amount of slop that's out there is actually persuading people to read more quality things rather than when I was young, we wasted a lot of reading. We read everything, and frankly, a lot of it was crap. I read music journalism and film journalism and 3 newspapers, and in a way, you don't need to read all that. You can consume all that on social media and everything else, and radio and clips. But I think maybe if I'm trying to be positive, I think maybe the amount of information means that actually people are a little more careful in editing down what it is they read, but they read that just as seriously as they ever did. I think. I hope I'm right. I might be entirely wrong. I'm basing it on a small sample.
Yes, but I guess maybe a good way to test that or to look at it is maybe by looking at your writing.
Yeah.
So if you look at your writing from, let's say, 1999,
Yeah.
your writing today, has it changed? Can you recognize an evolution that perhaps is a response to the changing world or changing modes of engagement with the media?
That's an interesting question. Another interesting question. I think it's always a surprise, I think. You'll know this as well, I'm sure, to look at your work when you were younger and to recognize exactly the same person that you are now. There's a tendency to think that you must have developed, you must have evolved somehow, all that experience, that if I write something now, it's so much fuller of knowledge and experience than something I wrote when I was 30. But it's not actually. It may be a little bit different, but probably what I wrote when I was 30, maybe I even put more effort into that than I do now. Because you're so full of things to say when you're young. You're so full of positive energy and enthusiasm, and you have so much to say. As you get older, you realize that not everything you have to say is interesting to other people. So you edited it. You become a bit tighter. But broadly, I don't think I've changed at all. No, I might be wrong. I don't read my old stuff, but very occasionally you have to edit something 20 years ago and you read it and you go, that's quite good. I couldn't do that better now.
But is it responding, or has writing evolved in relation to how our attention has evolved? Do you see any change in that?
I think what's changed is the qualifiers. I think now you maybe were a little more certain of a viewpoint 30 years ago, or a little less equivocal. Now you have to say, this is really great, but there's a huge amount of concrete in that. It's insane. Actually, it's not a sustainable way to build. It's a great building, but it's a mad way to build. You just have to think about it. Consider things like, is the competition, was it all white men on the panel? Or you have to think about these things in a way that you just didn't actually 30 years ago. We were much more naive and much less aware of the limitations of that culture, the issues of diversity and inequality and so on. You could write, I think, about £1 billion project 10 years ago or 20 years ago in a different way than you would now. You would say, well, is that really the best way to spend £1 billion? And I wrote this piece actually for the zine about when Gaza started to be leveled, about how can you be an architecture critic when this is going on? This is clearly the thing that is the worst, the worst crisis at the moment. And if you're interested in architecture, then the leveling of Gaza is the architecture story. But you somehow have to keep on writing about art museums and nice houses as if this is just background noise. And it's a difficult position for a critic to be in. And possibly 20 years ago, you would have taken a different attitude on that. You would have, architecture culture was more discreet, more kind of hermeneutic in a way. Hermetic. I meant to say hermetic. So I think now you're not forced to be, but you made yourself more aware of all the other issues that coexist with architecture, whether it's racism and inequality or environmental destruction or issues about land ownership or whatever it might be. So I think these things impinge on the culture of architecture more than they did on all of us, on me too.
Yeah, I guess that's a very kind of clear and identifiable thing that happened in culture. But yeah, I guess another person we had at the publishing forum at the AA was Dejan Sujic, who took us really beautifully through the history of publishing, the magazine publishing on architecture. And he then also took us very thoroughly through the history of Blueprint, which kind of is 90s, early 2000s history of a certain kind of architectural culture, mediation of architectural culture. But then it kind of ended and it stopped.
Yeah.
And so many of those media outlets or conversations, if we call them conversations, they stopped and evaporated. I guess whether you're lucky, however you want to put it, but that you're within an institution that transcends just one single theme. But I guess you would have also observed architectural criticism or architectural publishing going through waves. And I guess that would have also in some ways impacted you, because maybe, as you say, you're now one of 3 architectural critics in the country, where maybe 20 years ago there were 20. What does this do?
It's problematic. It is problematic because there was a moment. So Blueprint was the perfect, how would you call it, denominator of a moment when design was cool. It was co-opted by the broader culture. So you mentioned that I started in 1999. Well, that was the lead up to the millennium and the big kind of celebrations in East London and so on, which were very much discussed in terms of architecture. Tate Modern opened in 2000 and Serpentine Pavilion opened then, and architecture was very much part of a broader cultural discourse about what Britain could be in this country anyway, about what Britain could be. Maybe the discourse on the continent was a little bit more advanced, 10 years advanced of us, more sophisticated. But there was this moment in the late 80s, 90s where design was a pivotal part of the culture, and its tentacles spread from club culture to fashion, to some extent into music. You had a lot of architects were becoming musicians, and it had a kind of broad impact. You used to watch adverts on TV for German cars or something, and they'd show an architect getting into his BMW or something. Architecture was, this was the thing to do. So there was that moment when architecture was part of a kind of culture of cool, and it wasn't necessarily healthy for architecture, frankly, but nevertheless, it did breed a kind of broad discourse, which was good, which was really interesting. And there were people like Martin Pawley or Owen Hatherley or Mark Fisher or whatever, but people with very different views, extremely different views, writing, even Rainer Banham, when I started, was kind of more or less still around. So there were these kind of very, very kind of eccentric range of characters, all able to write in a broad range of publications. So you'd get very offbeat characters writing about architecture in the mainstream press. Quite odd. Not necessarily just architecture critics, but other people from around the. If you think now of Ian Nairn, this kind of drunken, strange, very English character being on the BBC, writing, doing these shows about architecture. It's inconceivable now that the BBC would do something about architecture that wasn't about nice homes or something. So it was taken much more seriously. I remember there was this program, Building Sites, where they asked architects to pick their favorite buildings and talk about them. And it was an accepted part of the discourse. That's gone. And to some extent, architecture is responsible for its disappearance, because I think architects have made themselves difficult to understand sometimes. And the intellectual end of architecture now is not interested with engagement with the broader media, because the things they're talking about are either so catastrophic in terms of what needs to be done, or they're so intellectual that they find themselves stranded on a branch somewhere, increasingly cocooning themselves. So if a member of the public was to go to the AA and try to understand what students are studying there, it would be completely incomprehensible, which is okay. Probably the AA was always like that. But architecture doesn't necessarily do itself any favors in communicating what it's trying to do to a broader public, I think.
I mean, that's such a. But having said that, there was a really interesting moment recently with the opening of the V&A storehouse.
Yeah.
Which I think in a way reminded us a little bit of architecture being that thing that everyone is excited about.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. No, it was a really interesting moment, I think. And there are occasional glimpses of that still. I think the last big one, I think, was Tate Modern, where you had this moment where, without doubt, that's London's greatest public space, without any doubt at all, I think. And it was, in a way, the things that it touched on, how you regenerate a city, how you reuse an existing space, how you take the opportunity presented by an enormous existing space to create something that you would never be able to create if he had to do it from scratch. You'd never say, well, we want a lobby that's the size of 40 football pitches or something. You're never going to get that. So that was a really interesting moment where people were able to see what architecture could do and could do for the city. But they're few and far between, I think, those moments. There aren't many of them in London. There are a few, I think, from Switzerland or in Belgium or in Spain, but there are not many, not many here really. It's fairly the ambition for architecture in this country is pretty low, I think.
This opens up questions in different directions. I guess maybe before we talk about this country, I just want to stay on this question of this spark a bit longer. And I guess what's interesting about let's say the V&A building in Stratford is that in some way was mediated through social media. So they had an appeal on a kind of on a reel or on TikTok or however people were kind of engaging with it, and then it created this moment.
Yeah.
And that's probably something new. It's almost a space that works really well on digital, on social media somehow.
But I think that from an architectural point of view, the thing that's the most interesting about the storehouse is that the architects were relieved of the responsibility of making architecture. So it was an existing building, and a pretty banal existing building. They didn't have to make an icon. They didn't have to make a big statement. They just had to remodel the interior of this building, basically using, I don't know, IKEA storehouse kit, isn't it? I mean, it's just racking. But yet they've done it really well. And the curators have persuaded us that we're somehow curating our own path through the museum rather than following an absolutely predetermined route through exactly what they want to see, which is what is actually the case. But nevertheless, we have the impression that we are roaming through the kind of back end of a museum. It's very clever. It's very low budget. It's a very clever way of reusing architecture and showing what can be done through adaptive reuse, I think. And it's a very interesting thing for an institution which obviously has in the V&A South Kensington its own incredible identity. You don't need another identity. You don't need to build. And I think actually they've done the wrong thing probably in Stratford with the new museum they're going to build there, where they are building there, where they're kind of presenting another identity. I think this would have been enough, actually, the storehouse. But yeah, it's a great project, and I don't know, about how it's been mediated and stuff, but it's definitely been. God, I haven't heard much bad about it, which is extraordinary for a British institutional project. Everyone seems pretty impressed. They like it. A couple of curators have said, "Well, it's kind of a scam, actually." You're being led to believe you have a degree of freedom of choice as you walk through this building, but actually it's just exactly as carefully curated as any other museum.
Yeah, I think one thing that I was particularly impressed by is exactly the public excitement about it.
Yeah.
The kind of this impression that it's almost like a piece of propaganda in a way.
Yeah.
Because it's mediated, very clear idea, people are excited about it, and everyone is on the point. I think you yourself have almost pointed the kind of question of architectural culture within this cultural environment, which is the UK. And it is that I've been exploring with many people in conversations recently, mainly because I had just done this project where I was looking at Irish architectural culture, and I was looking at the work of Shane de Blackham, who in some ways I would argue is a kind of a grandfather of Irish architectural culture.
Yeah.
Because he had worked for Kahn, and his partner in the practice, John Marr, worked for Aalto. And I think this influence of Aalto and Kahn is very prevalent and visible in Irish architecture. And as I was embarking on that project, I was talking to Kenneth Frampton, and the first thing Kenneth said was, well, Ireland has a culture, unlike this place. Which, of course, I understood and I value the culture that exists. But of course, there are certain reasons why that's the case. I mean, it's a much smaller cultural environment. There's only like 1 or 2 or 3 schools, 4 schools now, and so on and so on. But maybe I'd like to invite you to react to this idea of culture and something that maybe we don't have here, but maybe exists in other places. But then there might also be something good in plurality. Where do you see pros and cons in this conversation?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. There is an Irish architectural culture. There is a Belgian architectural culture. There are Spanish architectural cultures, but they're all different. There's one in Mallorca, there's one in Barcelona, there's one in Madrid, and they're all based on identity. So they tend to be the smaller places that have a need to express their identity through architecture. Britain is too big for that. And there really hasn't, there is a kind of, oh God, how do I say this? There is a kind of mad racist nationalism, which everyone runs a mile from, because as soon as Britain starts to talk about expressing its own identity, anyone on the liberal spectrum all the way to the far left will run a mile and immediately shout racism, because we are a colonizing culture, not a colonized, or at least for 1,000 years, not a colonized culture. So we were the oppressors. The reason Ireland has an architectural culture is because we screwed them over for hundreds of years. I don't mean to. That sounds, like we're responsible for Irish architectural culture, which is not. Obviously, it's Irish architectural culture, and it's brilliant, and I think it's really vibrant and really fascinating, actually. But it comes out of a condition of needing to express some kind of national characteristic and to try to unite communities around something, which I think Britain has been conspicuously bad at doing. And where the last moment maybe where there was an attempt to do something like that was the late 90s, the kind of Blairite era, which was disastrous, based around the sort of PFI projects and, a load of cultural schemes, which I think pretty much have turned out fairly disastrous, actually. Apart from Tate Modern, not many of those buildings really emerged with any great esteem. But there was then a moment, I don't know, it expressed itself in different parts of the culture, whether from Oasis or rave culture to Blairite architecture. And it was part of a kind of broader national taste and a national sort of movement. But it never came from a place of soul. Whereas the rave culture, for argument's sake, or indie music came from a very carefully kind of thought about and edited culture of what was cool, and what music had come out of Britain, how Britain has synthesized music in the past 50 years from American, blues through to Chicago house or whatever. There was a very, very knowledgeable and careful understanding of what those cultures were. In architecture, that really wasn't the case. I don't know how deeply to go into this, because I get quite upset about the whole thing. But I think there was a moment in the 60s in Britain where archigram ruined everything. And it's deeply unpopular and very particular, position for me. But I think high tech and archigram and the movement that came out of a misunderstanding of Victorian engineering, I think was deeply problematic, because other countries at the same time, Spain or Italy or to Belgium to some extent, a lot of Central Europe and Eastern Europe, they were developing ideas about public space and a re-engagement with the historic city, and a kind of a deep engagement with community, culture, built material, built space, the kind of world as found. Whereas in Britain, we were building the Millennium Dome or the projects that were really nothing to do with anything except an idea of Victorian bravado stations or the Crystal Palace or something. It was based on a kind of weird misinterpretation of a kind of colonist's idea of the world. And I think British architecture took a wrong path, which it never quite recovered from. Sometime in the late 60s, it just kind of veered off. And with a few exceptions, I think really it ran into difficulties. It created amazing monuments, the HSBC building in Hong Kong, or Lloyd's building in London, or the best of them is the Pompidou Centre in Paris. But that's really not British architecture. It's Rogers, who's half Italian, Piano, who's fully Italian, and it's in Paris. And it's brilliant, but it's not really, in a way, it's not really British architecture. The British version of that is Sainsbury's in Camden or something. So I think there has been a problem with British architectural culture, and interestingly, the schools are amazing. So the schools here are brilliant, and there is an intellectual discourse around architecture without a doubt, and there are occasional moments where there emerge interesting movements or interesting kind of diversions in architecture. Whether it's something like the people who emerged around Tony Fretton in the 90s and the early 2000s, like Sergeant Bates and 6A and Mark Pimlock, and they've got really good architects and designers, or whether it's the moment around Assemble and this idea of a kind of slightly more anarchic, self-building, responsive, community-led thing. There are these really interesting moments, but they tend to be kind of tangents. Whereas I think if you look at, say, Flanders architecture or architecture in Mallorca, there is a real powerful direction. There's social housing, there's public space, there's intelligence, and everything from the lampposts to to the way a courtyard is built. And it's just a kind of granular intelligence, which is pretty broadly lacking here, I think.
Mhm. I guess what's interesting in that is that, again, you acknowledge that there is a discourse.
Yeah.
Um, there is such plurality, I feel. But as you say, it's not landing. It's not
Yeah.
landing as a manifestation of anything in particular.
Yeah. The discourse, man, I think we touched on it earlier, but I think the discourse in this country manages to be somehow apart from the culture.
Mhm.
And that sounds oxymoronic, but nevertheless, the discourse is interesting. You go to what Ellis Woodman has done at the Architecture Foundation. You go there to see a Belgian architect that I maybe have never heard of in his late 30s, and they sell out 1,500 seats in the main theatre, or 2,000 seats. I mean, it blows my mind. It's incredible. So the interest in architecture of even the most obscure type is absolutely there. And that's why I think that the collapse of architectural media that you were talking about earlier is a bit surprising, because the interest is clearly very much present.
Mhm.
The question, I think, about publishing, you talked about publishing earlier. The publishing is, I suppose, the advertising has collapsed to some extent. Dezeen was the media equivalent to Archigram in the 60s, to architecture culture. Dezeen killed everything. I'm not devaluing Dezeen itself.
Yeah.
It has its place. But if everything is free and nothing is really written, so nothing is really critical, you take a big chunk out of the quality of the discourse. And I think that was Marcus Fairs was a friend of mine, and I always kind of admired him for what he did. But I hated Dezeen, actually. I think it was disastrous.
I mean, what was interesting in what Tom said in a conversation we had with the AA was that Marcus started the zine as a response to gatekeeping in architectural publishing.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it was a genuine response. It was a reaction against maybe not being able to publish. Yet it's very subverted now. And
Well, there's a reason. Exactly. If you find a cool club, somewhere, and you go a few times and you think this is fantastic, and then they stop gatekeeping, it's not a cool club anymore. It's just a place like everywhere else with too many people in it. And in a way, that's the problem with stopping the gatekeeping, is that it just becomes full of trash, overpopulated with uninteresting stuff. And you look at Dezeen now, which on occasion is interesting and useful, but you look at it and you don't know why this stuff is in there. Is this just in there because they sent some nice pictures in and they haven't had something from Georgia for a while? So, or is it there because someone has said, actually, this is really great. This needs to be published. Or is it a kind of an advertorial? Is someone paying for it to be in there? See, because if you're uncertain about why these things are in there, it's slightly problematic. But that's the culture. In a way, I think to some extent, Instagram is probably or TikTok has probably taken over from Dezeen now. Young people probably consume their architectural imagery directly from social media, bypassing the actual sites now, I think. So the gatekeeping has collapsed even a little further.
And I think it's collapsing even further because AI and ChatGPT are actually stopping people from even going into historical archives of digital media outlets. So apparently there's a big drop in the visits to archival material.
I understand that too, and it's the same with the media. So they deliberately cut out the FT or New York Times. That they're deliberately now not in the top tier of research results. And partly that's what AI is doing. It's digesting what's already been written and presenting it as its own material. Maybe that's all right. I don't know.
I think you're very critical of the, let's say, lack of culture. I think what you say about Archigram is particularly interesting.
Well, I think Archigram, they weren't interested in theory, for argument's sake. It was a very British. It was a very British response. A very graphic kind of comic book, superficial, funny, parodic, satirical. It was kind of more Monty Python than than Claude Bell or something. And that kind of cynicism towards theory or anything that smacks of intellectualism, I think is a current that's very much alive in British architecture.
Mhm.
Um, and maybe you don't. And you talked about Irish architecture. You don't have that in Irish architecture. They're
No, there's
willing to
no
talk.
cynicism.
Oh,
No.
yeah.
They're very
And it's the same in
serious.
literature. Yeah, and it's the same in literature. There's a kind of defensiveness here about the intellectual.
Mhm. But then I'm just looking behind you, let's say the OMA books, and I mean,
Yeah.
we could also talk a little bit about postmodernism. I think that there is a kind of inherent cynicism, criticism in postmodernism. But let's say if you talk to anyone from OMA, like if they're not on record, they're actually extremely cynical of just the world and architect's role, and of course that they're building, and they probably don't talk to clients in that same manner.
Mhm.
Um, but actually, probably in a weird way, they do emerge from that culture. Like OMA ran study that
Yeah.
but it's exported, it's elsewhere. Do you see any relevance of, let's say, postmodernist discourse, and what is the relevance of it in architectural discourse today?
Yeah. Yeah, I do. I mean, I think we're still in a very much. I think where we are now is far more postmodern than where we were when postmodernism emerged. I think now we're in the kind of real postmodern condition where you put a search in and you don't know if what's coming up is actually true, or it's a machine making this up or hallucinating it. When you look at social media, you don't know whether that's a bot or a person, or they're shilling something, or you're completely uncertain of where things are coming from. So everything levels out to some extent. Maybe the few last bastions of news like the FT or the New York Times or the Guardian or whatever, they still have a little credibility or gatekeeping, as you referred to it. But broadly, you're lost in this sea of stuff. Um, and
Mhm.
at the root of postmodernism, I think, was this rather French idea that everything is all these viewpoints are equally valid, and there is no one right answer. And I think to some extent we're bang in the middle of the most severe results of that moment. So I think we're absolutely in a postmodern moment now. Much, much. I think we have a tendency to think of postmodernism as classical columns and a portico on a commercial office block, but that's not postmodernism. Postmodernism is the kind of is the cultural relativism that was beginning to emerge in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and is now absolutely exploding.
Hmm. But when you take that theory of postmodernism and when you trace it against Charles Jencks, how does that compare? How do those ideas compare?
But Jencks was very, very controversial in a way because he was fundamental in defining the aesthetic of postmodernism, you know,
Mhm.
the language of postmodern architecture, and then with his house and then with his subsequent books, which were all about um, further definitions of postmodernism. But at the same time, what he said was that um, after postmodernism emerges, everything is postmodern. You can't escape it. You can't say, well, I'm not postmodern, because you're taking a position as, for argument's sake, a neo-modernist is as postmodern a step as you saying, well, I'm a classicist. And I think, that idea of taking a position being one of those choices inherent in the postmodern condition is absolutely fits today. I think all of these, whether they're kind of magpie architectures picking from bits of the past, or taking their inspiration from contexts, or whether they are a kind of radical reimaginings of a kind of post climate catastrophe or post apocalyptic world, are equally kind of postmodern in their attempt to define themselves against the mainstream, but actually they're just They're all just styles in a way, I think, and it's a it's a slightly unpopular position to take, because our postmodernism became so hated for my generation, who studied postmodernism was so kind of despised because it just degenerated into a style that everyone really disliked, that no one wanted to be associated with the word postmodernism, with the description of postmodernism, because it meant Michael Graves or Terry Farrell, or, you know, it meant the kind of debasement of contemporary commercial architecture. But at its heart is something very different, was this much more French idea of a sort of Baudrillard kind of condition, or a sort of Foucault condition, in which everything is kind of Derrida, actually, everything is leveled out, and no opinion is privileged. No one version should be privileged. I mean, I think in a way we've now caught up with that moment where, particularly in the debate around decolonization, that the ideas of a middle-aged white man, you know, are no more important than someone, you know, on Instagram, you know, which is, to some extent, it's fine. I think that's the moment that we live in. And, you know, although despite what I do, I think it's kind of an interesting way forward, actually, that if people were able to have their own platforms and their own voices without the intermediation of the huge tech conglomerates, then I think that would be a very interesting position. Of course, we're not there yet. You know, everything is very carefully mediated by those platforms and the algorithms and everything else. But let's say that the impression of what we have is a simulacrum of postmodernism.
But it's almost the next stage would then be a total dissolution of everything. It's a total dissolution, because I guess the postmodernism, there is also another backdrop, is the economic backdrop, which is a kind of liberalism of individualism, which is all part of the initial postmodernist idea that your character and personality.
Well, I think initially, so Jencks's preoccupation was with meaning. That how do we communicate? How does architecture communicate something? So coming out of late modernism and the kind of the banality of late modernism, let's say, the corporate late modernism, where architecture failed to communicate to the masses and was becoming disliked, you know, but so, you know, whether it was social housing in this country or in the States, or whether it was in the communist countries, where it was clearly not connecting to people, not communicating. So what Jencks was trying to do is how does architecture communicate? Is that through a series of visual meanings, visual references or symbols or icons? Is it through some more broader kind of cultural recognition? So for him, that's what postmodernism meant, was how do we re-enchant architecture with a sense of meaning, and how do we use architecture as a tool for communication? In a way, I think that's still a pretty good way of looking at architecture, even if you reject, to some extent, as I do, the legacy of postmodernism as a style. I think the underlying notion that architecture should be able to connect with people in some way, should be able to remind them of something else, or evoke some emotion or sensation or some historical recognition in them. I think it's still a pretty solid way of looking at what we do.
Well, it goes back to your earlier point that architects made themselves difficult to understand.
Yeah.
Yes, even more. So would you say that the postmodernism was attempt to communicate, but then maybe taking that to an extreme is like it's possible when everyone is communicating something completely different?
Yeah, and I think just to pick you up on what you totally justifiably said about what I said, is that I should have communicated that clearer, which is that most architects don't have anything to say or anything to communicate. So they're building to a kind of series of planning regulations. They've seen what's been accepted, and they're going to build something that's similar, but bigger, big as they can get on the envelope. That's it. That's the extent of the ambition. And then there is another subset, a very small subset of architects who really try. But I think what I should have said, or how I should have clarified it, was that the concerns of architectural culture of the kind of culture that's expressed through biennales or exhibitions or the kinds of publications that architects distribute amongst themselves are not necessarily chiming with the broader public. So I think architects are maybe interested in a different set of things to what the broader public is interested in. Maybe that's, probably that's okay, but it doesn't help that the intellectual end of architecture has been entirely dissociated from the practical end of architecture. I think probably for the first time ever. Because you mentioned Rem. Well, all right, Rem now is not the force that he was, obviously, but at one point he was absolutely the crux of architectural culture. And he was very much engaged with the intellectual end. Herzog de Meuron as well, to some extent. They were talking about art and talking to artists and very interested in kind of contemporary cultural ideas. I don't know who else there might be. Those are they're two examples, but I think now there is a complete dissociation of. So if you think of the younger generation of architects, whether it's Thomas Heatherwick or Mad or Bjarke Ingels, they're using the kind of language of OMA, but divorced of any of the intellectual content. So they use the tricks. They just converted that into a series of kind of easy to sell presentation devices,
advertising devices.
Yeah,
but not the Frederick Price kind.
No. Cedric Price, incidentally, I think comes from the same tradition as Archigram. So I think he's also fairly disastrous for British architecture. And it's interesting that he's so hero worshipped, because he's a fascinating figure, but not one who's a healthy architectural predecessor, I think. So there is this understanding that the answer is not always a building. Well, that's true, but if you're an architect and you make money from architecture, the answer is always a building.
I guess that the thing that I value in Cedric Price is, well, he's responding to a culture, right? He's also responding to certain limitation, certain kind of oppression that he feels within the culture. So he's a reactionary.
Yeah, but he's those British architects, who come along occasionally, who doesn't like architecture, which is okay. It's okay to have a rebel like that, but he didn't want to build, really. That wasn't his, that wasn't his métier. And to have, so I think that's something that's also prevalent in British architecture, that there is in the intellectual end of British architecture, there is an animosity towards the actual construction of buildings. It's the first thing almost I said, where I think now that when you go into a crit, you see students doing landscapes and rewilding schemes, anything to avoid putting a building on the site, because they know as soon as they do that, they'll have to justify why they're using concrete or why we're talking about air conditioning or whatever it might be. And there is a deep antipathy, I think, in British architectural culture to actually building at all. It was there when I was studying as well in the 80s, the kind of age of deconstruction and so on, where buildings were kind of unfashionable, and it was really much better to outline a theory, and then you couldn't be criticized in quite the same way, because you didn't have a drawing. You couldn't say, well, the plan doesn't work, because what you had was a kind of radical upsetting of everything through a literary device rather than a structure.
Well, another person that was at the Publishing Forum was Sam Hardingham, who did that.
Cedric Price, of course. Yeah, of course. I apologize.
We'll talk about Cedric Price, but what I enjoy having loads of people there, because there are certain threads that emerge. And one big thread, Eddie, that I was so surprised by, and I think it's really starting to emerge, is Alison and Peter Smith's re-celebration of them. And I mean, even Samantha mentioned, as she spoke about Cedric Price, she mentioned an anecdote where Peter Smithson walked out of a Cedric Price crit at the AA, where he just said, well, this is just advertising, this is not architecture. So I think a lot of people are going back to Alison and Peter Smithson.
Absolutely. And I think it's something the Smithsons come back every 10 years or so. There was definitely a moment 20 years ago when they were in, and Serge and Bates were talking about them a lot, and they were featured a lot in the British kind of architectural culture. There were exhibitions about them with new publications about them. Everyone was writing PhDs on them. But I think in a way they are also problematic in British architectural culture, the Smithsons, because what they built was not useful generally. All right, the social housing was okay, but it was hardly the best social housing. And that it's really interesting. Their summer house is for sale now in where is it? Wiltshire, I think. They're the solar house, which is the most amazing thing. It's the most beautiful thing. But it's not really a building. It's just it's an extension of a garden wall, beautifully done. And they had to have a cottage around the corner where they actually lived because it's completely uninhabitable. Hasn't got a toilet, hasn't got, it overheats in the summer, it's too cold in the winter. And I think occasionally British architecture tends to alight on the wrong thing. And the Smithsons, I think, is one of is one of those things where
So if you were to identify a seed of something optimistic, where would you go? Where would you find it?
in this country, in Britain,
Yes.
um,
In the past 50 years, let's say.
yeah. Well, that's that's interesting. I think there have been a lot of moments, and I think Fat, for instance, were great. I think Fat were severely underrated, and there was an idea that architecture could be provocative, pop, funny, and also quite good architecture. I think that was a very interesting moment. And there was a moment in the early 2000s, I suppose, or yeah, early 2000s, when there was an incredible ecosystem of British architects from 6A to, I don't know. I mean, he's cancelled now, but David Adjaye at the time was interesting. Mark Pimlott. But there were there were probably 7 or 8 very interesting figures and practices, each doing a very different thing, but within a broad intellectual framework, or probably all looking up to the Smithsons actually, but also looking at British architecture yeah, but probably also looking at British architecture in a more European framework. But where is the positive in British architecture now? I think that the positive probably, to some extent, is still in the intellectual end of it, in the schools, in the publishing, in what's left of the discourse. There's not a massive amount of good building here. It's hard to be super positive. I live in an area of London which is just burgeoning. There's towers going up all over the place. And it's just kind of brick, slip, generic stuff.
Yeah.
And if I think of what would be built if this was Hamburg or Berlin or Barcelona, there would just be so much more attention given to the architecture. How could this create an interesting open condition? How could the dynamics respond to what's already there? And this is just pretty dumb development stuff, basic, very, very basic. So I do find it hard to be super positive about British architecture, but at the same time, there is still a big center of gravity here. There are a lot of the most interesting people in the world are teaching here. A lot of the architects here are doing things they're not building here. They're building in Holland or they're building somewhere else. So
I mean, it's an absolute, I think London is an absolute epicenter. I don't know if there is a place in the world which has that many good architects in one place, let's say.
yeah.
Anywhere in America, America's so dispersed. Like there isn't.
The only places that may be able to compete are New York, where you have a similar intellectual culture, but it's even more distant from the actual culture of building in America than it is here, I think, in New York. And then Zurich, possibly, ETH in Zurich, where you do have some really interesting figures teaching.
But then again, Zurich is one school.
Zurich,
New York is only a very small part of American, even like Yale, Harvard, they're nearby, but they're not there, not in New York.
No. And New York's other problem is that New York is convinced that it's the center of the world, so it doesn't look beyond itself. which inhibits it from being a more interesting global center, I think. Even though everyone from the world wants to be in New York and wants to teach there, and they somehow don't take full advantage of that. I think London's sense of its own decline is always helpful in inculcating an architectural culture, because people are not here because they necessarily want to make their careers in London, but because it's full of interesting people. So it's not it's a kind of decaying city full of mistakes and full of kind of problems and issues, but it is genuinely open to ideas, I think. So there's the upside.
Well, I'd love you to see the work of my students at the AA. I'm really curious about what you would make of it. But, we're building on that legacy of Pascal Schoening. I don't know if you remember Pascal in late 90s, early 2000s, who worked with film. And there is a kind of inherent poetry in that, kind of valuing observation, which, to me, that's maybe where something novel can emerge. If we actually, for a moment, just look at the world. And I know what's interesting is your work in trying to, again, put an emphasis on writing and the importance of writing, which is a bit like a very active focusing the attention.
I mean, I think to talk about writing for a moment, it's very undervalued in the architecture world. So architectural writing is unreadable in almost in its entirety, and it's a real problem, because ultimately I don't read much architecture anymore, because it's just awful. Even if the architecture it's writing about is interesting, and even if the ideas that are being expressed are interesting, the actual quality of the writing is just not. It's not seen to be important somehow. And architects are very responsible for that. There's not I know there is it's a sort of visual culture. And there's a fear, I think, of writing outside academia. Academia, the problem is that the writing is for other academics. It's not expected to be read.
Yes.
And that's one end of unreadable, and then the other end of it, unreadable, is the kind of more commercial, self-promoting end. You read about architects writing about themselves. Well, that's pretty awful too. But the critical middle has dropped out, and not talking about myself and my world, because I'm at the kind of commercial end of architectural criticism, but the other end of architectural criticism, which is the more what would we call it? The kind of, it's called, for argument's sake, the more academic end of criticism, doesn't really exist anymore. Instead, there are kind of reactive manifestos, but actually careful dismantling of a building or an idea or a kind of cultural artifact is not really there. There's a bit. And there are some lovely books being published. I mean, really beautiful books, but they're not that great inside.
I mean, my argument is that, and it goes back to my use of film in my pedagogical project, is that maybe at the core of that issue is a lack of looking.
Yeah.
Maybe we actually don't really know how to look, or we're not taught.
That's absolutely right. 100% right. I think that looking and noticing absolutely was absent. Yeah. I think that's a very good point. And I absolutely agree with you. Yeah.
Because, we take students around. Like last year, we had this amazing trip. We went to New York and we went to see amazing buildings. We went to New Haven and actually visited. We were there on the opening day of the renovated Center for British Art.
Right. Yeah.
And I don't know if you were there on that day.
I was there. No, I was there probably a couple of days earlier.
Oh, a couple of days earlier. Okay. And it's just this kind of of course, it's all beautiful. You're kind of there in this atrium and you just kind of look at it, but that's not looking, is it?
No.
And I guess the attention to looking comes from also practicing. So I think in a way you have to have drawn some detail. It's hard enough to achieve on site, but then it will make you look at the world differently. And so I think there's a real kind of dialogue there between experience and.
I think that's right, but it's also the case, I think, that maybe now the most the sharpest critiques of architecture and design are not from architecture and design; they're outside. So I read a book on holiday a couple of weeks ago, Vincenzo Latronico. It's called Perfection.
Okay.
It's about a young Southern European couple in Berlin and their, wonderful life with their flat. They're kind of what you call it, digital nomads, and they have this apartment which they Airbnb sometimes, and it's their plants and their objects. And I was reading it and thinking, this is the sharpest critique by far I've read of contemporary living conditions actually, and design and everything. But it's by a novelist, by a young Italian novelist. And I think that's increasingly the case, that the real critiques of architecture are not coming from architecture, which maybe didn't used to. I think that the sharpest critiques of architecture used to come from Koolhaas or whoever, or Derrida or Foucault or whatever. But they were from a more intellectual framework, whereas now I think they're from a broader cultural perspective.
Mhm. And we just need to find it, I guess. We just
Yeah.
get
Yeah. But there's just not that much. Maybe I'm not finding it because there is also a problem. I'm not that young anymore. And there does come a problem as you get into sort of later middle age where you lose touch a little with the younger generation, inevitably, because I still think of young architects as my friends who are now in their 50s or 60s even. And the younger generation, the 30-year-olds, whatever, just I don't know what they're doing. I don't know what they're reading, what they're writing necessarily. I try and keep myself as fresh as I can. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe if I talk to those people, I will find that actually there are very sharp critiques in architecture, which are really interesting and the rest of it. But I'm not seeing them.
Mhm.
And I have a feeling that I would be aware of them if they were there.
Mhm. I guess, well, and I'll let you go, Eddie, but I guess my argument there is that I think there's something about being in dialogue and being in a kind of cultural space, because it's easy to talk about culture as this kind of big monolithic structure, but really it comes from spaces of talk and
Yeah.
terrace at the AA where everyone's smoking, or
Yeah.
these kinds of spaces. And I think there's also a disconnect, a general disconnect. If you're not connected, if you're not in dialogue, like how can there be a culture?
Well, that's, I think it's one of the setbacks with the postmodern condition
Mm.
is that every viewpoint is valid.
Mm.
In a previous era, potentially, you would have had more vociferous arguments between sects of architects, which is not always healthy, in a school, particularly in a crit or something, because everyone is just constantly reinforcing their own position at the expense of someone else. But for a culture more broadly, it does kind of enforce a kind of discipline on ideas that people begin to defend a position. Now, if you say you think this, I don't say, well, you're wrong because there's this, this, and this. I say, oh, yeah, cool. Yeah, that's great. Because I don't want to offend you. So, that is slightly, I think, problematic. I think conversations need a little friction. But I also agree with you that talking is absolutely fundamental. I have my best ideas are always when I say to a friend, I'm trying to formulate this thing, and he says to me, no, that's probably not like that. It's more like that. And then I say, oh, and then I either say, oh, you're absolutely right, or I say, no, you're absolutely wrong. And then I realize why he's wrong or she's wrong. So it's always the conversation that shapes what you think. Even at my age, when I'm completely entrenched in my own opinions and occasionally a bit arrogant about what I think, I still have conversations in which I think, oh, I'm entirely wrong about this.